Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Reyna. My pronouns are he, him, and I decided to do my presentation on polyamory and consensual non-monogamy. So polyamory is something that I'm actually pretty familiar with. I did some personal exploration on the topic a couple of years ago. I read More Than Two, which is a very enlightening text. There's a whole website dedicated to it, and there's just a lot of destigmatizing information about um, polyamory and different styles of relationships. And my takeaway from it was that there are a lot of really important core tenets about polyamory that I think are applicable to all relationships. But because of the stigmatization of polyamory, um, it gets harder to uh, for people to kind of be convinced that there are good things going on. So it's important to me to do some destigmatizing and breaking down why culturally, socially, polyamory deserves a chance and deserves to be examined and understood and accepted. Um, I want to do a quick location of self too. So I identify as cisgender. I identify as hetero presenting, male, Mexican American. Um, I uh, grew up in the US. I received a pretty good education, privileged, and yeah, I personally um, currently identify as monogamous, but that's also something that as we'll continue on, we'll see that there's a lot of flexibility in understanding that and communicating that too. And I, through my exploration of this, I kind of landed on a couple core concepts about relationships that I think are important and applicable, like I said. So I made a little abbreviation there: track, trust, respect, autonomy, communication, and kindness. I think those are all important ingredients in relationships, no matter what they look like. Um, so moving forward, just kind of keep that in mind: trust, respect, autonomy, communication, kindness. Does a relationship have this? I think those are things that make a relationship healthy. So let's talk about monogamy first. So we grow up in usually a monogamous culture. We understand love through the lens of monogamy. There is one person out there, right? Your one true love, and they're your everything. And so a lot of messaging about what relationships look like, what love looks like, is through the lens of monogamy. So quickly going through this checklist, there's a whole 66 item checklist about monogamous privilege. I think it's important for us to examine first before we get into deeper um, concepts about what polyamory is. So, monogamy. I can legally marry whomever I wish with all the legal, medical, and financial benefits of marriage universally recognized for me and my family, no matter where I live. No one argues that my relationship orientation is impractical, unstable, incompatible with commitment, or otherwise effectively impossible to realize. No one argues that my relationship orientation works better in theory than in practice. No one really says that about monogamy. People don't ask why I made the choice of my relationship orientation. It's not questioned. I do not have to fear revealing my relationship orientation to friends or family. It's assumed. I am guaranteed to find sex education literature for people with my relationship orientation. We'll often see people who are in polyamorous relationships. There's not a whole lot of literature out there. There's not a whole lot of models of polyamory that people can look to and understand. Um, it's hard to find, but not for monogamy. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my relationship orientation will not work against me. Imagine if for polyamorous couples, polyamorous relationships, I should say, if one person is injured in the hospital, what does that look like for them to be able to see the person that they love? Um, for that person to see the people that they love. I'm not asked to think about why I am monogamous. It's a big one. We don't really question monogamy. It is not assumed that I am inclined toward my relationship orientation purely for sexual reasons. People think that polyamory, just kind of the stigma around it is it's for sexual purposes, and it's not necessarily. There's, different ways to be intimate and connect with others. And no one takes issue with their children being around me based on my relationship orientation. We'll get into a little bit about some of the problems that polyamorous folks face when it comes to children as well. But this is the culture we were raised in, that we experience, that we uh, have our messaging about what relationships should look like. And so consensual non-monogamy is really just an umbrella term, right? There's a lot of different ways that consensual non-monogamy looks, but basically all partners give explicit consent to engage in intimate, romantic, and or, it's important, and or sexual relationships with multiple people. So about 1 in 5 have engaged in a consensual non-monogamous relationship at some point in their life, right? They look different. 4 to 5% of people are currently in consensual non-monogamous relationships. So consensual non-monogamy can look like monogamish, where um, there's an explicit rules based around, well, we're together, but there are opportunities for you to see someone sexually, or open relationships. Um, that's one we hear a lot too, where it's explicitly just sexual. Um, Whereas monogamish could be, they don't want to put labels to their relationship yet, but they're still kind of seeing other people. Um, you know, it's a little more gray. Polyamory, which we'll get into, swinging, which is another one that is pretty popular and well understood. Couples sharing partners with other couples. Polyfidelity, um, which we'll get into also, but basically um, things like triads, or it's a closed group, maybe 4 people, 3 people, 5 people, 7 people, whatever the case. They are involved in intimate romantic sexual relationships with only each other and no one else outside of that group. That's polyfidelity. Relationship anarchy, where there's really no labels. Relationships are fluid. Group marriage. So the big thing about this, obviously, consent. Every party in these relationships consents. They are explicit about what the boundaries are. So that's different than affairs, cheating, religious practices. There's not consent in those cases. So it can be hard, especially growing up in a monogamous culture, where if you see anyone who isn't your partner, that is automatically cheating. And there's with consent involved, there's a lot more of a gray area and a lot more to discuss there that is usually harder to discuss. So polyamory, as a term, it appeared as early as 1953, but it was adopted around 1990 as an alternative to responsible monogamy. So when we think about polyamory, when we label ourselves as polyamorous, for example, is that a relationship philosophy? Are we choosing to be polyamorous? Are we born polyamorous? Are we born monogamous? Are we choosing to be monogamous? These are questions. There's uh, studies that show that it can be yes or no. Depends on the person. Depends on how they identify. Just like nearly every other identity too. Um, it depends on the person. Depends on how they feel about the life that they're choosing to live. So it is possible, meaningful, and legitimate to have multiple concurrent significant relationships. Um, this is, again, for growing up in a monogamous culture, the default is monogamy, and anything outside of that is an aberrance. And our job is to not see that as an aberrance, especially when we have clients coming in. Um, they're experiencing that all throughout their life, and the counseling room is the place where they get to not experience that, and it's up to us to be able to provide that. And so some things that I learned about polyamory and consensual non-monogamy, here are some of these relationship structures that I talked about. So where you have the V, where you have one person in a relationship, who is involved with multiple different relationships, but those other people are not involved with each other. Triad, where everyone is involved with each other, but not outside of that. Um, one of the things that one of these papers highlighted was secret non-monogamy, which is obviously not consensual, but non-monogamy is already a very common thing that occurs in relationships already. The important thing about consensual non-monogamy is communication, defining your own relationship rules, what the boundaries look like. One of the what a great concept that polyamory um, kind of champions is compersion, which is the opposite of jealousy. If you type in compersion in a Word document or in this presentation, you're going to get the red squiggly because it's not an actual word. It's not recognized by many of the things that we use as an actual word. But we don't have an opposite of jealousy. Jealousy is one of those things that is pretty inherently understood as um, an okay thing to feel, even if it's something that can cause issues. Jealousy is normalized, but compersion is the opposite of jealousy. Whereas jealousy, you feel, um, you know, anger or resentment or fear by seeing your partner involved with someone else. Compersion, you feel joy, you feel happiness, you feel excited to see your partner fulfilled. Um, and so championing that feeling of compersion, I think, is super important and how we approach jealousy. Autonomy is also a very important aspect of consensual non-monogamy, allowing people to choose the path that they want for themselves and have those decisions and choices be supported by the people that they love. And really just the human capacity for love. At the end of the day, um, we have tended to put ourselves in pretty rigid boxes and rigid expectations and uh, put on my hippie hat for a little bit. Love is really something that is not uh, easily contained in those in rigidity. Um, so hippie hat off. So some therapeutic issues that come up. What happens when children are involved, right? Many couples might, I keep saying couples, many relationships, many poly relationships might have children involved in it too. How 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 is that navigated, for example? Um, some people might look at that and say, well, that's not a good environment for the kid. Other people might look at it and say, well, there's more people taking care of this kid. Um, so when it comes to us as therapists, we might be expected to provide some input on that. If there's it's something that the legal system doesn't really support, doesn't really get behind. Um, but that's one of our biases that we need to address. Coming out also is a very scary thing because, again, it's not something that is widely accepted. Um, Monogamy is still the mainstream. Monogamy is still the standard, and anything outside of that is met with judgment. Some unconventional family systems are already a thing that exists, right? We have multi-generational families. We have uh, step parents, stepchildren, multiple marriages, we already that nuclear family doesn't really exist in the same way that it used to, or even that we thought it used to. Unconventional family systems are much more common, and poly involves more unconventional family systems, and so that's something that we have to be mindful of too. And again, examine our biases. This is a really great image that kind of shows the impact of those biases. When we don't examine ourselves, what um, we've internalized as normative relationship structures. We can do harm to the client. We can elicit things like closeting, hiding their behavior, some defensiveness. The tendency might be that the person in the poly relationship might expect that their therapist is going to uh, problematize, I think that's the word, make the problem the poly relationship when that might not be the problem. That might not be why they're in to see you. And having that be highlighted as a problem is stigmatizing and reflects more on our biases than it does on the client. So it's up to us to really challenge what normative relationship styles look like, and then how this contributes to gay and sexual minority liberation, polyphobia, shame, isolation. These are things that are experienced often in with gay and sexual or with gender and sexual minorities. And so any way that we can relieve that is important. That many people who are in poly relationships are also identified as gender and sexual minorities. Where there are trans people in poly relationships, there are asexual people in romantic relationships, there are gay, lesbian, like all different types of people get involved in poly relationships. There's no one determinant, um, aside from people who tend to challenge cultural norms and biases. They tend to be more supportive of poly relationships and are typically more involved in them too. And yeah, just legal issues surrounding poly relationships too, when it comes to children, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to hospital rights, uh, civil rights, just being able to support poly relationships and be an advocate uh, will help not only people in poly relationships, but anyone who wants to explore outside of just regular relationship structures, or more normative relationship structures, more typical, more expected relationship structures. How this relates to intersectionality too. So many times people who are in poly relationships, this might be their first time that they've experienced being marginalized. Many people who are, for instance, white, wealthy, um, all the other privileges um, that we see in society, they're in a poly relationship suddenly. This is maybe their first taste of being marginalized. That's important to recognize too. Um, Gender, many, when it comes to gender sexuality too, many gay men, it's pretty common for there to be monogamish relationships where there is an understanding of um, being able to see other people sexually, but within certain rules. Maybe it's a don't ask, don't tell type thing where um, you're not informed on what's happening. Maybe they want to be informed. Maybe they want to have a say in how this um, is approached. Um, so it can be important to recognize that that's the relationship style that is pursued. Culture, religion, um, we'll get into that a little bit more too. But just thinking about how there's some religions that practice polygamy, um, it's important to be aware of that, and to keep in mind like where they might be at too with um, families accepting. So all of these are important to consider too. So I want to start talking about theories. Relational cultural theory is one that I think is applicable for many poly relationships. So there's a feminist multicultural lens, really emphasizes the need for connection and relationship for healthy development. Connection and relationship is how we grow. And so understanding that through the poly lens, people will be in poly relationships because there is something about this relationship that helps them grow and helps them be more authentic. Um, a sense of self will develop through these meaningful connections. Um, And then relational cultural theory just really kind of identifies the mechanisms of oppression and resilience that anyone who is LGBTQ or gender sexual minority experiences. And so poly is included in that too, breaking down what it means and how it feels to live outside of the expectations of a monogamous culture. And just understanding the cultural complexity that is involved with clients too, how all the intersecting identities come to play. Um, you know, discussions about around shame, authenticity, those are important topics that can be addressed through relational cultural theory. How are they experiencing the shame? Is it through the system of oppression that they're living in? Is it through their family system? Is it through, work? Is it through understanding how all these different aspects of their environment impact them is important to explore through relational cultural theory. And then I wanted to also choose a theory that wasn't really talked about in class, but it was talked about in my other counseling theories class, but I feel like is important because if we're going to talk, I honestly, this is something that I think we all in this class get and understand and are accepting and supportive of. But our colleagues who aren't in this class, who haven't taken a class like this, they'll understand Gestalt theory. And so being able to speak to them in with a theory that is understood, I think is important too, or a theory that is well accepted, well understood, well utilized in the mainstream. So Gestalt theory, main highlights of that, takes a holistic view of the individual. So it examines them holistically. There's validation of subjective experience, the way that they experience life is met with unconditional positive regard. There's a high value on autonomy and self-determination. People have the right to make decisions for themselves. And then there's also a good highlight of how feelings are signals that shape awareness and guide action. So when it comes to Gestalt theory, for people who are exploring consensual non-monogamy, not just that they're in a poly relationship, but maybe that you're meeting with a client whose partner is suggesting an open relationship, right? Going back to what we were talking about, jealousy, that can be something that culturally, like we just don't really address jealousy effectively. I mean, we don't address many emotions effectively, but jealousy is one of those things that I think that doesn't really get the same kind of examination or put under a microscope in the same way. So Gestalt theory will really help to raise awareness of these emotions. Where is this coming from? Why is their partner commenting on them with this? Why is this, when you feel jealousy, what is that rooted in? Where is that really coming from? And so understanding the self-awareness, the congruence of self and environment, understanding like the process of those feelings rather than the content of those feelings themselves too. Paradoxical theory of change is one of those things too that is an important part of Gestalt theory. When we stop trying to change, when we stop actively trying to make ourselves change, is when we actually do start changing. And so that's something I think is very important to examine in the sense of monogamous relationships and breaking down what that looks like, and what that really entails. Like, what is really the messaging under monogamous relationships? And I think Gestalt theory can really get into a lot of self-awareness of the client, and help them understand where is all of this rooted in, and how has my experience impacted my belief system? How has my culture I grew up in impacted my belief system? So there's a holistic view again. So I think Gestalt theory can really be important for us to be able to talk to our colleagues in terms of using as a way to address what people in consensual non-monogamous relationships are experiencing. So strengths when it comes to this population, I obviously um I strongly support consensual non-monogamy. I think that if you are able to communicate with your partner and talk about boundaries, that is something that is important in any relationship. Again, track trust, respect, autonomy, communication, and kindness. If you're approaching your relationships with those things, I think that that's a pretty good start, and that's a pretty good solid foundation for any relationship, monogamous, polyamorous, or otherwise. I have experienced consensual non-monogamy. I have dated someone who was in a polyamorous relationship, and so do have that personal experience. So it's something that I have experienced firsthand and seen um, how this relationship was negotiated. Some of the struggles, cultural norms about relationships. Still, I mean, growing up in a monogamous culture, that's still something that kind of sits in the back of my mind that I have to challenge and I have to reaffirm of like, no, there's other ways to explore this. There's other ways to communicate this. Polygamy is something that I think I will struggle with too. The more I think about it, um, a lot of times polygamy, which is the marriage, one one male identified person marrying multiple female identified people. Um, to me, uh, it's hard to shake a feeling of um, patriarchy involved in that. Male supremacy, really just the institution of marriage being used to subjugate women. Um, that feels like that's there in many cases, but it might not be in all cases, and that's something that I need to examine further, and kind of pick apart for myself and understand, where is that coming from and what can I do about it if a client comes to me in this particular relationship style. Current advocacy that's going on. Um, APA has the Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy. It is an excellent resource. Just look up APA Division 44 and you'll find a lot of advocacy work going on. There's research, there's practice, like there's education and training. There's like a lot of little pamphlets, a lot of things that exist already, that you can print out right now and that you can bring to whatever practice you're working at, wherever you go for your internship. You can go right now and print some of this out and have available and use as a resource for yourself, for clients, for your colleagues. It's such an amazing resource, and they do such a great job of organizing information and destigmatizing. Um, and so I highly recommend anyone who's interested in doing that, which I hope would be everyone. Check this out. Look up the information on there. It's super helpful, super important. It was really helpful for me as I was doing this research too. And then future advocacy, things that I want to start doing for myself too. Education really is like the number one. Just keep reading, keep understanding, keep listening to other people's experiences. I think phenomenology is important here. Like there's not a whole lot of research, um, but what is out there really is a wealth of knowledge, and part of that is other people's experiences, other people's subjective experiences. So that's important for me to continue reading, acknowledge a consensual non-monogamous affirming stance. So like I've done here, full acceptance, full understanding. This is something that is valid. Um, you know, that's something that I want to be good at communicating too. So creating inclusive environments. One example of doing that is by on any intake form, having uh, a section to fill out for relationship style. Let people define for themselves what their relationship style is. Not everyone fits into the rigid box of monogamy. As we saw earlier, 1 in 5 through the course of their life it, are involved in a consensual non-monogamous relationship. So it's important for us to provide that space and to start with us, start creating that inclusive environment, start with our language, start with our approach to social justice and creating environments for non-traditional ways of approaching relationships. Um, yeah, all of this is just as valid as any other relationship. When you think about why relationships persist and why relationships break up, I mean, it's just a lot of the same reasons for monogamous relationships and polyamorous relationships. Whenever relationships break up in polyamorous relationships, the polyamory aspect of it is what usually gets the blame. But when monogamous relationships break up, people don't blame monogamy for that. It's the person. It's a person, and it's, the actions they took during the relationship has nothing to do with polyamory, has nothing to do with monogamy. And so starting by changing our viewpoints on monogamy and really the chokehold it has on society, um, and kind of opening ourselves to understanding, you know what, there are different ways of expressing love. We already know that. There are different ways of expressing love. And polyamory, consensual non-monogamy, is just another way. It's another way of expressing and communicating love. And that's it. Thank you so much. Here are my references. Um, yeah, I really enjoyed this. And I hope that this helps open some minds. And then now it's up to you. You got to go talk to people about monogamy and be like, hey, why is this so normal? Should this be? Yeah, thank you.